There's a unique quiet that settles over a home after the chaos of raising boys finally softens into the low hum of the refrigerator. For 15 years, that was my peace. Raising Ryan, Caleb, and Evan was the unspoken vow I made to the empty space my daughter, Jessica, left when she vanished. We built our own little world on scraped knees, shared secrets, and the 3 plates I set out for dinner every single night. I thought the echoes of her absence had faded for good. Then, she reappeared not with remorse, but with a lawyer, accusing me of stealing the very children she hadn't called once in over 5,000 days. She had acted like we weren't there, until our life without her became something she wanted to take. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too. My name is Margaret Hayes, and for the last 15 years, my world has been defined by the steady, predictable rhythm of raising 3 boys in a second-floor apartment in Chicago, the scent of chicken soup simmering on a sick day, the percussive thud of a basketball against the pavement below our window, the quiet shuffle of textbooks across the kitchen table. These were the foundational elements of the life I rebuilt from the wreckage of my daughter's choices. Our home was not a place of luxury. Its walls absorbed the sounds of teenage laughter and late-night arguments rather than displaying exquisite art. The sofa, a secondhand find from a decade ago, had surrendered to the shape of 3 growing boys, its cushions a silent witness to countless movie nights and whispered confessions long after bedtime. This was our sanctuary, a fortress built not with money, but with the unbreakable mortar of routine and unwavering love. I often found myself watching them, seeing the ghosts of their father in the sharp line of their jaws, or the easy confidence in their smiles. Ryan, my oldest, carried a quiet intensity, a mantle of responsibility that settled on his 17-year-old shoulders too early. I saw it when he was just 6. The day Caleb fell from the jungle gym and broke his arm, Ryan hadn't cried. He'd simply wrapped his own small jacket around his wailing brother and stared down the paramedics with the ferocious gaze of a protector. Caleb, my dreamer, moved with a gentle grace, his emotions always simmering just beneath the surface. He was the one who found a half-frozen sparrow last winter and spent 3 days nursing it back to health in a shoebox. His heart an open wound of empathy for anything that was broken. And Evan, the youngest, was the observer, his silent gaze missing nothing. He didn't speak as much as his brothers, but he saw everything, the slight tremor in my hands when the bills piled up, the way Ryan's jaw tightened when their father's name was mentioned. His mind was a quiet ledger of our family's truths. They were good boys, had grown into remarkable young men, and every bit of their character was forged in the fire of an absence they were too young to understand. That absence began on a frigid November morning that had promised snow. I can still feel the icy draft from the open apartment door on the back of my neck. Jessica stood there with a single suitcase, her face pale and drawn. There had been no dramatic fight, only a chillingly quiet declaration after a week of tense arguments about money and freedom. "I can't do this anymore. Mom, I'm drowning," she'd said, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion I so desperately wanted to hear. "I wasn't meant for this. I can't be a mother." I had pleaded, offered to take more shifts, to move in with her, but my words were stones falling into a well. She placed the infant twins into my arms, their combined weight a sudden, terrifying anchor. Her oldest, barely a toddler, clung to her leg, and she had to gently peel his fingers away. That was the last thing I remember clearly, the sight of her prying her own child's hand from her leg before turning away. She never looked back. The silence she left behind became a living entity in the apartment. A 4th child I had to manage. I learned to fill it with lullabies, with the bubbling of macaroni and cheese on the stove, with the drone of the television during cartoons. I filled it with my presence, working double shifts at the diner long after my bones ached for retirement, learning to stretch a single paycheck to cover the needs of 4 people. We never wanted for anything essential, but every dollar was a soldier sent into battle against some new expense. There were no lavish vacations or brand new cars, only the steady assurance that there would always be food on the table, a warm bed, and a grandmother who would stand between them and the harshness of the world. Our life was a carefully woven tapestry of small joys, the pride of a first-place science fair ribbon, the shared laughter over a burnt pizza, and I had long ago accepted that our story was complete. I never imagined a chapter I hadn't written could be so violently inserted. Until the day a gleaming, obsidian black sedan with Colorado license plates purred to a stop in front of our aging brick building, its polished surface a dark mirror reflecting a world that was not ours. The driver's door opened, and a woman emerged. Stepping onto the cracked Chicago pavement as if it were a red carpet, it was Jessica. 15 years had chiseled away the frightened, hollow-eyed girl I remembered and replaced her with a sculpture of expensive tastes and curated success. She wore a cream-colored coat that seemed to repel the city's grit, and her hair fell in perfect, honey blonde waves around a face that was still painfully beautiful. As she approached our building, I felt the boys gather behind me at the window, their collective breath a warm cloud on the cold glass. The familiar peace of our afternoon was shattered, replaced by a thrumming, anxious silence. The past was no longer a memory, it was walking up our front steps. And I had no choice but to open the door. She stood on our worn welcome mat, her expensive perfume a scent of lilies and cold money invading our small hallway. Her practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she took in the sight of her sons, now towering young men, before the performance began. The tears came first, perfectly timed, crystalline drops that traced a path through her flawless foundation. She didn't storm in with demands, her approach was far more insidious, wrapped in the soft velvet of profound remorse. She spoke of a debilitating postpartum depression, a fog that had stolen her sanity. She talked of years lost to addiction, of therapy in sun-drenched clinics, of finally getting her life together and wanting nothing more than to reconnect with her boys. Her voice was a soft, melodic apology, painting a portrait of a victim, a woman who had been fighting a silent battle. As her words filled our small living room, my mind began its own silent rebellion, playing a relentless slideshow of memories that her narrative conveniently erased. She spoke of her illness, and I saw myself holding a feverish Caleb through a long night, the cool washcloth on his forehead a prayer against the heat. She spoke of feeling alone, and I saw myself sitting alone on a hard wooden bench at 3 separate kindergarten graduations. She spoke of her struggle to find herself, and I remembered the struggle of choosing between paying the heating bill or buying new winter coats for the boys. Her battle had been silent, she claimed, but mine had been deafeningly loud, filled with the cries of sick children, the slam of the door from bill collectors, and the unending whir of the diner's kitchen fan. I watched my grandsons, and I saw her words land on them in 3 distinct ways. Ryan stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression an unreadable mask, but his posture was a fortress of skepticism. He was my protector, the one who remembered the hunger and the fear of the early years most clearly, and his eyes held the cold, hard glint of a judge who had already reached a verdict. Evan, ever the quiet analyst, stood slightly apart, his gaze sharp and methodical. He tracked her every movement, the way her eyes flickered towards their worn furniture with a hint of disdain, the way her hands, perfectly manicured and unscarred by work, twisted a diamond ring on her finger. He wasn't judging her. He was collecting evidence, waiting for the truth to betray itself. But it was Caleb who was being torn apart before my very eyes. I saw the conflict warring in his face, the deep, instinctual yearning for a mother's love clashing with the 15 years of silence. His hands were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white, and I could see the sheen of unshed tears in his eyes. He wanted to believe her, desperately, in her carefully crafted narrative of redemption. He saw the possibility of a hole in his life being filled. The answer to a question he had probably been asking his heart his entire life. Why wasn't I enough, Jessica? A predator sensing weakness. noticed it, too. Her gaze softened and lingered on him, her words subtly shifting to address his silent pain. It was a masterclass in manipulation. While my head was screaming with the injustice of it all, I kept my face a placid mask. I knew I couldn't make this choice for them. To force her away now would be to slam a door on a question Caleb needed to answer for himself, and it would only make her a martyr in his eyes. With a heart that felt like a lead weight in my chest, I stepped back from the door, my voice steadier than I felt. Come in, Jessica. Let's talk. That first conversation set the stage for the weeks that followed, a period I now think of as a quiet, methodical invasion. Jessica did not make the mistake of pushing for too much too soon. She was far too calculated for a frontal assault. Instead, she began a campaign of subtle but relentless siege warfare, targeting the foundations of the world I had so carefully constructed. Not with force, but with seduction. Her intrusions began not with demands, but with deliveries that arrived like Trojan horses at our door. The first was a box so enormous the delivery men had to maneuver it sideways through our doorway, its sheer size a declaration of intent. It was for Evan. Inside was a gaming computer that looked more like a piece of alien technology than anything I'd ever seen. All sleek black casing, intricate cooling systems, and a soft, internal blue glow. It came with a monitor wider than our kitchen table and a suite of accessories that filled our small living room with the sterile scent of new plastic and untapped potential. I watched as Evan, my quiet, observant boy, unpacked it all with a focused reverence usually reserved for a delicate science experiment. For years, he had made do with the aging, sluggish computers at the school library, never once complaining about their limitations. Now, an emissary from a wealthier world sat humming in the corner of the room he shared with his brothers. Its glow became a new fixture in our evenings, a portal through which Jessica could reach him in ways I couldn't comprehend, pulling him into digital worlds where her influence was just a click away. His bedtime began to stretch later and later, the soft tapping of his keyboard a new, alien rhythm in the quiet tapestry of our nights. He was still my grandson, but now a part of him lived in a world she had bought for him and a world I could not enter. A week later, a long, slender case of worn leather and polished brass arrived, addressed to Caleb. He opened it with trembling hands, and inside, nestled in a bed of deep blue velvet, was a Martin acoustic guitar. It was not merely a nice instrument. It was the exact model he had a picture of taped to the inside of his closet door. The one he would talk about in hushed, wistful tones as something he might be able to afford someday. After college, after getting a good job, he lifted it from the case as if it were a sleeping child, his fingers tracing the fine-grained spruce top and the mother-of-pearl inlay around the sound hole. He didn't immediately play it, he just held it. His expression a turbulent mixture of overwhelming joy and a subtle, corrosive guilt. I saw his eyes flicker for a moment to his old guitar propped in the corner, a battered second-hand instrument I'd found for him at a pawn shop. Its neck slightly warped and its body covered in a web of tiny scratches, each one a memory. He had made beautiful, heart-wrenching music with that old guitar. This new one was flawless, its tone deep and resonant. But I feared the price of its perfect music would be a harmony lost forever within our family. Ryan, ever my pragmatist, was the most difficult to sway with a simple object, and Jessica knew this. Her gift for him was not something that could be delivered in a box, but a promise whispered over a series of coffee meetings she insisted on. Meetings at cafes with expensive lattes and an air of importance. She spoke to him not as a child, but as a peer, an aspiring man of business. She praised the rudimentary business plan he'd drafted for a small software application, a project he had poured his heart and soul into. She used words I knew she'd learned from her new husband: scalability, market penetration, seed funding. She didn't offer him a toy. She offered him a shortcut to his dreams. She spoke of connecting him with venture capitalists in Denver, of internships at tech firms that would dwarf any opportunity he could find in Chicago, It was a masterful move, an attempt to usurp my role not as his caregiver, but as his foundation of support. Ryan was tempted. I could see it in his eyes, not by the money, but by the intoxicating possibility of finally lifting the financial burden from my shoulders, of becoming the man of the house in a way he felt he never could while living under my roof. With the beachhead of her gifts firmly established, Jessica began the second phase of her assault. She started selling them a dream, a glossy, airbrushed alternative to their own lives. During her visits, her phone became a magic lantern, projecting images of a life that was as alien to us as a distant planet. She sent them a video walkthrough of the house in a gated community near Denver. They watched it huddled together on our worn sofa, their faces illuminated by the screen. I saw a sprawling modern structure of glass and stone, with rooms so large and empty they seemed to be holding their breath. I saw a turquoise swimming pool, an outdoor kitchen, and a home theater. It was a house built to impress, not to be lived in. A showroom for a life, not a home forged by love and memory. She would casually mention the prestigious prep schools nearby, name-dropping universities as if they were casual acquaintances, subtly painting the boys' excellent public school education as somehow second-rate. I watched the insidious poison of dissatisfaction begin to take root. They had never known they were poor. Not really. Until their mother arrived to methodically show them everything they were missing. The first casualty of this new war was the peace within my home, and the first to fall was Caleb. The change in him was gradual at first, then alarmingly swift. The new guitar, which had sat in its case like a hallowed relic, was now rarely out of his hands. But he wasn't playing the soulful, melancholic tunes he had composed himself. Instead, he was practicing flashy, complex chords from popular songs, the music feeling technical and hollow, an echo of someone else's success. The door to his room, once always ajar, was now often closed. I would hear the low murmur of his voice, and I knew he was on the phone with her. Their conversations were long and frequent, whispered exchanges that would cease the moment I entered the hallway. A wall of secrets was being built between us, brick by insidious brick. And it was a wall I did not know how to breach. He grew distant, a polite stranger at our dinner table, his thoughts clearly 1,000 miles away in the sun-drenched fantasy of Colorado. He started questioning things he had never questioned before: why we couldn't afford a better internet plan for Evan's gaming, why our car was so old, why I insisted on cooking instead of ordering out. Each question was a small paper cut, insignificant on its own. But collectively, they began to bleed the warmth from our family. Ryan saw it, his frustration simmering in the tense silence that now stretched between him and his brother. Their easy camaraderie, once the bedrock of our household, was replaced by a strained formality. Evan saw it too, his quiet gaze following Caleb with a new, worried intensity. I felt like the captain of a ship who could see the iceberg ahead, but whose crew had suddenly forgotten how to steer. Mesmerized by a siren song from a distant shore, the inevitable crack appeared on a cold Tuesday night. I was at the stove, stirring a large pot of chili, a comfort meal that had seen us through countless winter evenings. The familiar, savory scent should have been comforting, but the atmosphere in the kitchen was thick with unspoken tension. The boys were supposed to be setting the table, but instead, a low, angry argument was brewing at the kitchen table. Our family's traditional safe harbor now turned into a battleground. Ryan's voice was tight with suppressed anger. "I don't get why you talk to her so much," he said, not looking at Caleb. "Can't you see what she's doing? It's a game, Caleb. She's buying you, she's buying all of us." Caleb, who had been scrolling through pictures on his phone, pictures I knew Jessica had sent him, looked up, his face flushed with defensive anger. "She's not buying me," he retorted, his voice louder than usual. "She's my mother. She's just trying to make up for lost time. You don't have to be such a jerk about it. You go meet her for coffee." "That's business," Ryan shot back, finally turning to face him. "It's different. I'm listening, not believing. You actually believe this fantasy she's selling? She had 15 years. Caleb, 5,475 days? Where was she when you had that nightmare about the basement every night for a month in second grade? I was the one who sat with you. Where was she when Evan got his glasses and that bully Markson broke them? Grandma was the one who went to the school. She wasn't lost. She was gone. Grandma was here. The word grandma hung in the air, a testament to a loyalty Caleb was now being accused of betraying. I held my breath, my back still to them. The rhythmic stirring of the spoon, the only thing I could control in a world that was spinning off its axis. That was when it happened. Caleb shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the linoleum floor. His face was a mask of hurt and desperation, the face of a boy defending a dream he knew was fragile. "You don't know anything," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You didn't listen to her. She was sick. She had problems. Grandma always thinks the worst of her. At least she wants a better future for us." The final sentence landed in the quiet kitchen not like a shout, but like the shattering of something ancient and irreplaceable. The accusation that I, who had sacrificed every dream of my own for their future, was somehow standing in the way of it struck me with a physical force. The spoon in my hand stilled, clattering against the side of the pot. The bubbling of the chili suddenly sounded deafeningly loud. For a terrifying second, I felt the floor drop away from beneath me, and I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep myself steady. In the ringing silence that followed, I saw the immediate horror dawn on Caleb's face as he realized what he had said. His anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of shame. Ryan stared at him, not with anger anymore, but with a look of profound, sorrowful disbelief. Evan, who had been silent throughout, quietly stood up and began placing forks and knives on the table. A small, desperate attempt to restore a normalcy that had just been obliterated. But the words were out. They were hanging in the air, a toxic gas that could not be recalled. Caleb turned and fled to his room, the slam of his door echoing through the apartment like a gunshot. The enemy was no longer at the gate. She was inside our walls, and she had just turned my own soldier against me. The silence that descended upon our apartment after Caleb's outburst was a tangible entity, a cold, heavy presence that suffocated the air. The chili sat untouched on the stove, its comforting aroma now a mockery of the warmth that had been stolen from our home. Caleb remained barricaded in his room, the slammed door a monument to the chasm that had just opened between us. Ryan moved through the kitchen with a grim, tight-lipped fury, his movements stiff and deliberate, while Evan quietly cleared the table, his face a careful, unreadable mask. No one spoke. There were no words for this kind of wound, a betrayal that had come not from a stranger, but from one of our own. That night, I lay awake in my bed, the familiar sounds of the city outside my window drowned out by the deafening replay of Caleb's words in my mind. At least she wants a better future for us. It was a dagger crafted from my own love and sacrifice, now twisted in my heart by my own grandson. 4 days. A fragile, unbearable ceasefire held our family hostage. We moved around each other like ghosts, the space between us charged with unspoken accusations and profound sorrow. Caleb was a shadow, emerging from his room only for meals he barely touched, his eyes avoiding mine, his face pale with a mixture of defiance and regret. I knew then that I was out of my depth. This was not a battle I could win with patience and home-cooked meals. Jessica was not just a person. She was an idea, a fantasy of a perfect life that had taken root in my grandson's heart like a beautiful, poisonous weed. I was fighting a ghost with the blunt instruments of reality. And I was losing. It was in that moment of quiet desperation, sitting at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness, that I finally did the one thing I had avoided for 15 years. I opened my laptop, my fingers trembling slightly, and I wrote an email to Mr. Peterson. David Peterson was more than just a financial advisor. He was the last remaining link to my son-in-law. Michael, a quiet, meticulous man who had been Michael's closest friend since their army days. He was the one Michael had entrusted with his most precious legacy, his son's future. Michael had possessed a keen understanding of his wife's character, a tragic foresight that had led him to place his life insurance and savings into a tightly controlled trust fund. With David as the sole trustee, contacting him felt like an admission of failure, a signal that I could no longer protect the boys on my own. My email was brief and formal, stating only that Jessica had re entered our lives and that I had some concerns I wished to discuss at his convenience. I stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send, feeling as though I had just launched a flare into the night. Unsure if it signaled a rescue or a declaration of a war I was not prepared to fight. His reply arrived less than 24 hours later, not with a request for a phone call, but as a detailed, multi-page document secured with a password. The subject line was chillingly formal regarding the Morgan Boys Trust. I opened it with a sense of dread, my heart hammering against my ribs. The email began with a polite but firm preamble, stating that my inquiry was timely, as he himself had been on the verge of contacting me due to a number of disconcerting developments. What followed was not an emotional letter, but a cold, methodical dissection of Jessica's activities, laid out in the precise, emotionless language of a financial trustee obligated to report a potential threat. My eyes scanned the clinical prose, and a clearer, uglier picture of my daughter's return began to emerge. Mr. Peterson detailed 3 separate inquiries Jessica had made over the past month regarding the trust. The first had been a casual, informal request for information on the fund's total value. The second had been a more formal attempt to have herself listed as a co-signer on the account, citing her status as their biological mother. The third, and most alarming, had been a legally drafted letter from her attorney in Denver, asserting that as she intended to pursue full legal guardianship, she should be granted immediate access to a portion of the funds to facilitate the children's transition to a new, more appropriate living environment. Each request had been politely but firmly denied by Mr. Peterson, who cited the trust's unalterable stipulations. The funds were untouchable by any guardian and were to be released only to the boys themselves, and only upon their 18th birthday. But it was the second half of the email that made the blood run cold in my veins. As a diligent trustee, Mr. Peterson had conducted a risk assessment following the legal inquiry. Attached to the email were public records, credit reports, and business filings he had legally obtained. He laid out the stark reality of Jessica's life in Denver. Her new husband, a man involved in high-risk real estate development, was on the brink of financial ruin. His firm facing multiple lawsuits and a federal investigation. Their lavish lifestyle, the gated community, the luxury cars. The designer clothes was a house of cards built on a mountain of debt. They were months behind on their mortgage payments and their credit cards, with limits I could scarcely imagine, were maxed out. Jessica had not returned as a remorseful mother seeking to rebuild her family. She had returned as a predator, circling what she believed was a vulnerable financial lifeline. The boys weren't her children. They were her collateral in a desperate bid to save herself from the consequences of her own choices. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, not with a satisfying snap, but with the sickening crunch of bone. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the stark truth. There was no relief in being right, only a profound, hollowing grief for the daughter I had raised. A woman so empty inside that she saw her own children as nothing more than a means to an end. The document on my screen was more than just information, it was a weapon. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that I was going to have to use it, even if the fallout destroyed what was left of the family I loved. I waited 2 days, letting the cold, hard facts settle within me, allowing the anger and sorrow to cool into a steely resolve. I called the boys to the living room on a Saturday afternoon, an official family meeting that felt more like a court summons. The air was thick with tension. Ryan and Evan sat on the worn sofa, their expressions wary. Caleb stood by the window, his back mostly to me. a clear sign of the division he still felt. There was no easy way to do this, so I didn't try. I simply placed my laptop on the coffee table, turned the screen towards them, and said, "There is something you need to see. This is from Mr. Peterson, the man your father appointed to manage your trust fund." I didn't read it to them. I let them read it for themselves, watching as the cold, black and white text worked its poison. Ryan read it first, his face hardening with each paragraph, his skepticism, once a simmering fire, now blazed into a cold, controlled rage. He looked up at me, his eyes dark with a fury that was frightening to behold. "So that's it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It was never about us. It was always about the money." Evan read it over his brother's shoulder, his expression unchanging, but I saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. For my quiet observer, this was simply the final piece of data confirming a hypothesis he had likely formed the day Jessica arrived. He nodded slowly, a grim finality in the gesture. "It makes sense," he murmured. "All of it." But it was Caleb I was watching. He refused to look at the screen at first, but the weight of his brother's reactions finally pulled him in. He read the email, his eyes darting across the screen, his face growing paler with every line. I saw the progression of his emotions as clearly as if they were written on his skin. First confusion, then defensive denial, and finally, the shattering impact of a truth so ugly it couldn't be denied. The email didn't just expose his mother as a liar and a thief, it exposed his own desperate hope as a fool's errand. He had built a beautiful, fragile dream of a mother's love. And this document was a wrecking ball, demolishing it before his very eyes. He shook his head, looking at me with wounded, accusing eyes. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This is a trick. He's lying. You're both lying to turn me against her." He was no longer defending his mother, he was defending himself from the unbearable pain of his own disillusionment. Before either of us could respond, he turned and fled to his room, the slam of his door a familiar, heartbreaking echo. But this time, I knew what would happen next, through the thin wall. I heard the muffled, frantic tones of his voice, and I knew he was calling her. He was handing her the ammunition she needed, telling her that we knew, that her plan had been exposed. The final, desperate phase of her plan was about to begin. The summons came less than an hour later, but it wasn't a phone call. It was Ryan. His voice strained, telling me to come to the front door. A man in a cheap suit stood in our hallway, holding a thick manila envelope. He asked me if I was Margaret Hayes, and when I nodded, he handed me the envelope and a clipboard to sign. He was a process server. I closed the door and opened the envelope with hands that felt strangely steady. Inside was a formal petition filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County. It wasn't a lawsuit for kidnapping. It was something far more insidious. A calculated legal strike designed to dismantle my life. My daughter, Jessica Morgan, was petitioning the court for temporary and ultimately permanent guardianship of her three minor sons, Ryan, Caleb, and Evan Morgan. The document was filled with legal jargon, but the accusations were brutally clear. It cited my advanced age, my unstable living situation in a low-income apartment, and my limited financial means as proof that I was an unfit guardian to oversee their transition into adulthood. It accused me of systematically alienating the children from their loving and concerned mother. It twisted my 15 years of sacrifice into a narrative of selfish hoarding, painting me as a bitter old woman preventing her grandchildren from attaining the bright, prosperous future their mother could now provide. It was a masterpiece of fiction, a legal document that weaponized my poverty and my love against me. I stood there in my hallway, the cold paper in my hand, and understood that the war was no longer a secret fought within the walls of our home. It had just become public. The thick manila envelope lay on our kitchen table like a formal declaration of war. Its impersonal language, a brutal violation of the home I had fought so hard to protect. For 15 years. My battles had been fought in silence against the quiet enemies of poverty, illness, and the gnawing loneliness in the hearts of three little boys. I had faced them with patience and with a love so fierce it had become the very marrow in my bones. But this was a different kind of war, one to be fought not with quiet sacrifice, but with cold, hard truths in a world of lawyers and legal filings. The lawsuit did something I had not expected. It burned away the last vestiges of my grief for the daughter I had lost. The sorrow that had been my constant companion for a decade and a half cooled, hardened, and sharpened itself into something new, something forged in the fires of righteous anger. It was resolve. I was no longer just a grandmother protecting her flock. I was a woman defending her life's work, and I would not allow it to be dismantled by the careless, greedy hands of its own architect. The next morning, I did not call my daughter. I did not text her with pleas or accusations. I sent her a simple, 7-word message, a summons she could not misinterpret, the Rose Petal Diner. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. I did not ask if she was available. I did not offer an alternative. It was a command. I chose the location with deliberate precision. The Rose Petal was a small, unassuming diner 3 blocks from our apartment, a relic from a bygone era with its cracked red vinyl booths and the lingering scent of black coffee and frying bacon. It was the place I used to take Jessica for a chocolate milkshake after she'd had a bad day at school. The place where she'd confessed her first crush over a plate of greasy French fries. It was a place steeped in the memories of a simple, honest life she had long ago discarded. I wanted her surrounded by the ghosts of her own past, forced to confront the woman she had become in the shadow of the girl she once was. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming the corner booth we had always preferred, the one with a small tear in the vinyl that Jessica used to trace with her finger. I ordered a black coffee and waited, my hands resting calmly on the table. The legal documents and the printouts from Mr. Peterson's email were in my purse, a tidy, damning collection of facts. When Jessica walked in, she brought with her the aura of a different world. Her expensive coat and the subtle scent of her perfume were an immediate and jarring contrast to the humble surroundings. She slid into the booth opposite me, a look of strained pity on her face, the kind one might adopt for a senile relative. She was preparing to play the role of the patient, concerned daughter dealing with a confused, bitter old woman. It was a fatal miscalculation. "Mom," she began, her voice dripping with a false, gentle concern. "I know you're upset about the petition. My lawyer and I just felt that, given your age and the financial pressures, it was the only responsible way to ensure the boys have the best possible future." I did not let her finish her rehearsed speech. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out the first document, and slid it across the table. It was the printout of Mr. Peterson's email. "This is a communication from your son's trustee," I said, my voice low and even, devoid of any emotion she could use as leverage. "He seems to have a very different view of your financial situation and your motivations." I watched her face as she read. I saw the flicker of genuine shock in her eyes, quickly masked by a flash of anger. The mask of the concerned daughter slipped, revealing the cornered predator beneath. "This is an invasion of my privacy," she hissed, pushing the papers back towards me. "This man has no right." I ignored her, placing the second set of documents on the table, the public records detailing the impending foreclosure on her Denver home and the summary of her maxed-out credit lines. "These are public records, Jessica, the kind of documents a judge in a guardianship hearing might find very interesting. They tell a story not of a concerned mother, but of a desperate woman in financial ruin." Her face had gone pale, her composure crumbling. The practiced pity was replaced by a raw, ugly fear. She looked around the small diner, suddenly aware that her expensive armor offered no protection here. "What do you want?" she finally whispered. Her voice stripped of its earlier confidence. It was the question I had been waiting for. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze never leaving hers. "I want you to call your lawyer this afternoon and withdraw the petition. I want you to pack your bags, return to Denver, and deal with the mess you've made of your own life. And then I want you to disappear from my grandsons' lives. Completely and permanently." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the space between us. If you do not. I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I will submit every single piece of this evidence to the court. I will file a counterpetition arguing that you are not only financially unstable, but morally unfit to be their mother. I will make sure the judge, your sons, and the entire world know that you came back not for your children, but for their trust fund. You will not only lose any claim to them forever, but you may very well face an investigation for attempted fraud. For a long moment, she just stared at me, her mind clearly racing, searching for an angle, a lie, a weakness to exploit. But she found none. The woman sitting across from her was not the soft, forgiving mother she remembered. That woman had died a little more each time a birthday card failed to arrive, each time a feverish child cried out for a mother who wasn't there. The woman before her now was a stranger, forged in the crucible of 15 years of solitary responsibility. I saw the moment she understood this, the moment she realized she had lost. A shudder went through her, and she deflated, the fight going out of her. All right, she said, her voice barely audible. All right, I'll do it. She gave a shaky, unconvincing smile, a pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of control. You're right, it's too much, too soon, and I'll back off. She stood up, pulling her coat around her like a shield, and walked out of the diner without another word, leaving the ghosts of our past to settle back into the quiet hum of the old establishment. I watched her go, but I felt no triumph, only the profound, weary emptiness of a battle won at a terrible cost. I knew she was lying. A cornered animal doesn't surrender. It looks for another way to attack. I returned home to an apartment thick with a familiar, strained silence. My meeting with Jessica had not brought relief, only a heavy sense of foreboding. I knew I had won the battle. But the war for my family's soul was far from over. I knew my daughter. Her capitulation had been an act of strategic retreat, not of surrender, stripped of her legal and financial weapons. She would now turn to the only weapon she had left, the fragile, hopeful heart of my grandson. Caleb. My fear was realized later that evening. I was in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes, when I heard the low, urgent murmur of Caleb's voice from his room. The door was closed, but the pain in his tone was unmistakable. He was on the phone with her. I couldn't hear Jessica's words, but I could imagine them, a torrent of weaponized honey, of carefully constructed lies and theatrical tears. I could almost hear her painting me as a cruel, manipulative monster, a bitter old woman who had conspired with a corrupt trustee to steal her children and her reputation. The aftermath of that phone call was a quiet devastation. Caleb emerged from his room an hour later, his face pale and set with a tragic, misguided resolve. He looked like a young soldier who had just been convinced to fight for a noble, doomed cause. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't speak to Ryan or Evan. He moved through our home like a phantom, his spirit already 1,000 miles away, pledged to a woman who would not hesitate to sacrifice him. The final, desperate move came the following afternoon. I was folding laundry on the sofa when Caleb approached me, holding his phone. His hands were shaking. Mom needs my help, he said, his voice a raw whisper, his eyes pleading with me to understand, to believe. It's not what you think. It's not about the trust fund. He proceeded to tell me a story so convoluted and absurd it could only have been spun by a desperate narcissist and believed by a desperate child. Jessica had told him that Mr. Peterson's accusations were a smokescreen. The real reason for her financial trouble, she claimed, was an old business debt incurred by her husband, a debt of honor to a partner who had betrayed him. She told him that if they couldn't pay this specific debt, a much smaller, more manageable amount, they would be ruined, and her name would be dragged through the mud, making it impossible for her to ever clear her name and be a mother to them. She had told him there was a separate, smaller educational fund that his father had set up, one that he, Caleb, could access before his 18th birthday with a co-signature. She had emailed him the withdrawal form. She just needed his help, his signature, to prove to the world that her own son believed in her, to pay this one debt of honor and make all her problems go away. It was a brilliant, full piece of manipulation. It reframed the narrative, turning a story of greed into one of persecution. It made Caleb the hero, the one person who could save his victimized mother from the villains who were conspiring against her. He showed me the form on his phone, a simple electronic document that required his digital signature. She just needs this one thing, he said, his voice breaking, to prove I trust her. It's a test. Grandma, don't you see if I do this, she'll know I love her, and then everything will be okay. My heart shattered. I looked at my grandson, this beautiful, empathetic boy I had raised, and saw that his greatest strength, his capacity to love and to hope, was being weaponized to destroy him. I tried to reason with him, to point out the inconsistencies, to beg him to wait, to talk to Mr. Peterson. But my words were meaningless against the siren song of a mother's fabricated plea. He retreated to his room, the electronic form open on his laptop, the cursor blinking over the signature line, a tiny, pulsing heartbeat counting down to an irreversible mistake. I stood outside his closed door, my hands pressed against the wood. I stood outside Caleb's closed door, a helpless sentinel paralyzed by the chilling silence on the other side. My hands were pressed flat against the cool wood, as if I could somehow push my own strength, my own reason, through the solid oak and into the heart of my confused, heartbroken grandson. Every instinct screamed at me to break the door down, to snatch the laptop away, to shield him with my own body from the mistake he was about to make. But I knew that force would only validate Jessica's narrative of me as a controlling, manipulative jailer. He had to see the truth for himself. But I feared the price of that lesson would be a piece of his soul. Time seemed to warp and stretch, each ticking second of the hall clock a hammer blow against my resolve. My mind raced, searching for a path, a word, anything that could pull him back from the precipice. It felt like watching him drown in slow motion, just inches from the shore. It was then that a presence came to stand beside me in the dim hallway. It was Ryan. And a moment later, Evan was there too. They hadn't needed a summons. They had felt the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, terrible escalation of our quiet war. Ryan's face was a mask of cold, hard fury, his eyes fixed on Caleb's door. Evan stood just behind him, his expression grim and resolute. There was no discussion, no whispered plan. Ryan simply reached out, his hand closing around the old brass doorknob, and turned. The click of the latch retracting was unnaturally loud in the silence, a sound of finality. He pushed the door open, not with violence, but with an unstoppable, deliberate force. And we stepped into the epicenter of our family's crisis. The scene inside was one of quiet devastation. Caleb sat at his small desk, his back to us, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His face, reflected dimly in the dark screen of the window, was streaked with tears. On the laptop screen in front of him, the electronic withdrawal form glowed, the cursor blinking patiently over the box that read "Execute Signature." His hand was on the mouse, his knuckles white. He was in a trance, a prisoner of his mother's voice, which was still murmuring poison into his ear from the phone that lay on the desk beside him. He was so lost in his turmoil that he didn't even seem to register our presence. Ryan didn't waste a single word on Caleb. He moved past him in 2 long strides, his objective clear. He picked up the phone, his thumb moving with swift precision across the screen, and the tinny whisper of Jessica's voice suddenly filled the small room, amplified and undeniable. "Just have to trust me on this, sweetie." Jessica's voice cooed from the speaker, syrupy and cloying. "Your grandmother is confused. She doesn't understand these kinds of business matters, and this is about protecting our family's name. Just sign it, and I promise, everything will go back to normal. We can finally be a real family." "Hello, Jessica?" Ryan's voice was like ice. It was not the voice of the boy I had raised, it was the voice of a man pushed beyond his limit. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, a flicker of panic. Ryan, what are you doing? Let me speak to your brother. No, Ryan said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. You're done talking to him. You're going to talk to me now. I have a few questions for you. Let's start with the debt of honor. What's the name of your husband's former business partner? And what was the name of their company? I'd like to look it up. The silence that followed was heavy with Jessica's frantic search for a plausible lie. It's it's a private matter. Ryan, it's complicated. It's not something for children to worry about. We stopped being children the day you drove away, Ryan countered, his voice merciless. And we're not worried. We're just curious. Because Mr. Peterson seems to think your only business problem is a pending foreclosure on a house you can't afford and about $200,000 in credit card debt. Why? That seems pretty complicated. Two. So, which is it? Jessica, the secret debt of honor, or the public record of your financial collapse? This was the moment the mask shattered. The pressure of being confronted with undeniable facts, of losing control of her audience, was too much. The soft, victimized mother vaporized. And the true Jessica, the one I had seen glimpses of in the diner, emerged in a torrent of vitriol. You ungrateful little brat, she shrieked, her voice a raw. Ugly thing, how dare you speak to me like that? After everything I have been through, all the sacrifices I have made to get my life back on track so I could come back for you. I was sick. I was alone. You have no idea what I've suffered. We know what Grandma suffered, Ryan said quietly. And the simple statement was more devastating than any shout. Your grandmother, Jessica, spat, her voice thick with venom. She has been poisoning you against me from the day I left. She is a bitter, jealous old woman who couldn't stand to see me have a better life, that money in the trust. That is my money. It is owed to me for the 15 years of my life I lost raising you. You were supposed to be my second chance, and all you've done is cling to that old woman and her pathetic, miserable little life. I watched Caleb. He had turned slowly from the desk, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. He was hearing it all. Every selfish, entitled, venomous word. He was not just hearing that his mother was a liar. He was hearing that he was a burden, a meal ticket, an obstacle. He was hearing that the love he had so desperately wanted to believe in did not exist. The dream didn't just crack. It was annihilated, burned to ash in the fire of his mother's rage. I saw the light in his eyes go out, replaced by a vast, vacant, and shattered emptiness. The sound of trust breaking was not a sound at all. It was a profound, world-altering silence that consumed everything. On the other end of the line, Jessica was still raving, but no one was listening anymore. Ryan calmly disconnected the call, and the sudden quiet in the room was absolute. Caleb slowly, mechanically, reached forward and closed the laptop. He didn't look at us. He simply stood up, walked to his bed, and lay down, turning his face to the wall. The battle was over. The cost was incalculable. The days that followed were draped in a heavy, somber quiet. The family was whole again, united in a terrible truth. But we were all deeply wounded. Caleb remained in a state of self-imposed exile, a ghost haunting the edges of our family. He ate what I put in front of him, answered direct questions with monosyllables, and spent most of his time in his room, the new guitar sitting untouched in its case in the corner. He wasn't angry or defiant anymore. He was simply gone. He was grieving. Not for the mother he had lost, but for the mother he had never truly had. And it was a grief so profound that none of us knew how to reach him. Ryan and Evan were magnificent. They moved with a quiet, intuitive understanding, flanking their broken brother with a fierce, gentle loyalty. They would sit in his room with him, not talking, just being present. one of them reading a book, the other scrolling through his phone, their presence a silent promise that he was not alone in his pain. My role was to provide the steady rhythm of normalcy, the quiet comfort of clean laundry and warm meals, a stable ground for him to stand on when he was ready. About a week after the disastrous phone call, Ryan came to me and told me he had called Mr. Peterson to explain what had happened. He had recounted Jessica's desperate attempt to manipulate Caleb into signing the withdrawal form. I felt a surge of pride in his maturity, his calm assumption of a responsibility that should never have been his. I knew then that the final pieces were in motion. Far beyond our small apartment in Chicago, Jessica's attempt to commit fraud against a minor's trust, an act now confirmed by one of the beneficiaries, would be the final, irrefutable piece of evidence for the authorities who were already circling her husband's crumbling financial empire. We were simply waiting for a verdict that had already been decided. The news, when it came, did not arrive in a dramatic courtroom showdown or a sensational news report. It came on a Thursday evening, during a quiet dinner, for the first time in a week. Caleb had joined us at the table voluntarily, and a fragile, tentative conversation was beginning to bloom. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed Mr. Peterson's name. I excused myself and answered it in the kitchen. My heart braced for the final chapter. His voice was calm, professional, and devoid of any triumphant tone. "Margaret," he said simply, "I'm calling to let you know that it's over." He explained briefly that the federal authorities in Denver had moved forward with their investigation. Jessica's husband had been arrested that morning on multiple counts of wire fraud and money laundering. And Jessica, implicated by her husband and by the clear evidence of her attempt to defraud her son's trust, had been arrested as well, charged as a co-conspirator. There was no satisfaction in his voice, only a quiet finality. There would be no guardianship battle. There would be no more phone calls. No more gilded promises. No more threats. The storm had passed. They won't be bothering you again. "Margaret," he said, his words a quiet epitaph for my daughter's life as we knew it. I thanked him, my own voice a near whisper, and hung up the phone. I stood in the quiet of my kitchen for a long moment, letting the finality of it all wash over me. I felt no joy, no urge of victory, only a profound, soul-deep weariness. And beneath it, the first stirrings of a peace I had not felt in months. I walked back to the dining room where my 3 boys, my life's work, my only true legacy, were waiting. They looked up at me, their eyes questioning. I simply nodded once, a gesture they all understood. The war was over. All that was left was the silence, but for the first time in a long time. It was not the silence of fear or unspoken pain. It was the silence of closure, the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped, leaving us to survey the damage and begin the long. 6 months passed, and the silence in our apartment slowly transformed. It was no longer the heavy, brittle silence of fresh grief, but a softer, more malleable quiet filled with the unspoken acknowledgments of healing. We were a family learning to breathe again, each of us processing the wreckage of Jessica's storm in our own way. Caleb had gradually emerged from the cocoon of his grief, the vacant look in his eyes replaced by a quiet, somber introspection. He began to play his old, battered guitar again, its familiar, slightly warped notes filling the evenings not with sadness, but with a gentle, searching melancholy. Ryan poured his energy into his studies and his software project, his focus a shield against the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. And Evan, my quiet observer, became the family's barometer, sensing when to offer a joke, when to suggest a movie, and when to simply allow the quiet to be. We did not speak of Jessica. Her name became a ghost, a presence whose absence was now a source of our fragile, growing peace. The boys' 18th birthday arrived not with a grand celebration, but with a quiet, meaningful dinner at our kitchen table. I made their father's favorite meal, a rich beef stew that filled the apartment with the scent of memory and love. That evening, we spoke of Michael, their father, more than we had in years. Ryan shared a fuzzy memory of being held on his father's shoulders. Caleb remembered the deep, rumbling sound of his laughter, and Evan recalled the scent of his aftershave. They were piecing together the ghost of a man they had barely known, and in doing so, they were reclaiming a part of their own story that Jessica had tried to overwrite. A week later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Mr. Peterson met with us, and the abstract concept of their father's love was made tangible. The trust fund, once a weapon in a bitter war, was now simply their inheritance, a legacy of a father's foresight. The discussion that followed was one of the proudest moments of my life. There was no giddy talk of sports cars or lavish trips. I watched as my three grandsons, boys who had been offered a fantasy kingdom just months before, sat around our worn kitchen table and behaved like men. They listened intently as Mr. Peterson explained the investments, the tax implications, the sheer scale of the responsibility that now rested on their shoulders. Their first decision was unanimous and immediate. The bulk of the funds would be secured in separate, lower risk accounts designated for their college and postgraduate educations. It was a solemn vow to their father, a promise to honor the future he had died to protect. Then, Ryan, acting as the spokesman, cleared his throat and turned to me. "Grandma," he began, his voice steady and sure, "there's something else we've decided. For 18 years, you've made this apartment a home. You've stretched every dollar and sacrificed everything to make sure we were safe and loved. We think it's our turn to take care of you." He slid a real estate brochure across the table. It wasn't for a mansion in a gated community, but for a sunny, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet, safe neighborhood a few miles away, one with an elevator and a small balcony where I could grow my tomatoes. "We want to use a small part of the inheritance to buy this for you," Caleb said softly, his eyes meeting mine, full of a quiet, earnest love. "So you don't have to worry about rent anymore. So you have a place that's truly yours." My immediate instinct was to protest, to insist that the money was theirs alone. But Evan reached across the table and placed his hand on mine. "Please, Grandma," he said, "let us do this. A home is the first thing a family needs. You taught us that." Tears welled in my eyes, hot and sudden. This was their declaration of independence, not from me, but with me. They were not rejecting our humble past. They were building a better future upon its foundations, and they were insisting I be the cornerstone. The new apartment was filled with light, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I had a bedroom with a door that closed and a small balcony that tasted the morning sun. We moved the old worn sofa into the new living room, its familiar shape a comforting anchor in this new chapter. It was here, amidst the happy chaos of unpacked boxes, that the final ghost of the past arrived. It was a letter, forwarded from our old address, the envelope thin and cheap, the handwriting on it instantly recognizable. It was from Jessica, sent from a federal prison in Colorado. For a long moment, I held it. This final, paper-thin connection to my daughter. Part of me wanted to burn it, to eradicate her last attempt to breach our new walls. But that would have been an act of fear, and I was no longer afraid. I sat down and read it. The letter was a masterpiece of self-pity, a rambling, disjointed narrative of her innocence and victimhood. She blamed her husband. She blamed the justice system. She blamed her difficult childhood. She spoke of finding clarity in her cell, of realizing that family was the only thing that mattered. The words of remorse were there, but they were hollow. Phrases copied from a book on redemption, devoid of any real accountability. It was the letter of a stranger, a woman so lost in the labyrinth of her own lies that she no longer knew the way out. There was no satisfaction in reading it. No anger, only a vast, quiet pity for the empty shell of a person my daughter had become. When I was finished, I did not rip it up. I did not burn it. I simply folded it, placed it back in its envelope, and put it in the bottom of an old wooden box filled with memories I no longer needed to visit. I did not need to forgive her to be free. I just needed to let her go. A few weeks later, as we were finally settling into our new life, the boys came to me again for another family meeting. They had something important to tell me. Ryan, again the spokesman, held out a set of official-looking documents. "We've been talking," he said, sharing a look with his brothers. "Dad gave us our future, and you gave us our lives. We want our name to reflect our whole story." He explained that he and Evan had filed the paperwork to legally change their last names to Morgan Hayes, hyphenating their father's legacy with mine. It was a gesture so profound, so full of love and recognition, that it took my breath away. They were claiming me, not just in their hearts, but in the eyes of the world. Then I looked at Caleb. He was not holding any papers. "I'm not changing my name," he said quietly, but without a trace of the old conflict in his voice. "I'm going to stay Caleb Morgan." He saw the question in my eyes and continued, his voice gaining a new, mature confidence. "For a long time. I think I was ashamed of that name. Because of her, I wanted to be someone else. But it's my father's name. He was a good man. I'm not going to let her poison his memory. Keeping his name, it's my way of taking it back. It's my way of saying that she doesn't get to define what it means to be a Morgan. I do." I looked at my grandson and saw not the broken boy from 6 months ago, but a young man who had walked through fire and emerged with a quiet, unshakable understanding of who he was. He was not erasing his scars, he was choosing to own them. And in doing so, he was truly healing. The story ends here, but our life did not, but it ends in our new kitchen. A warm, bright space that is slightly larger than our old one, but 100 times more peaceful. It ends on a Sunday afternoon, with the four of us crowded around the countertop, flour dusting our clothes, our hands working together to fold wontons for dinner, filling the air with easy laughter and the shared, shorthand language of a family that has survived. I watch them. My boys. My remarkable men. Ryan, the steadfast leader. Evan, the insightful observer. And Caleb, the resilient heart of our family. I see the men their father would have been proud of, the men I was honored to raise. Jessica's punishment was not her prison sentence or her financial ruin. Her true punishment was this: she was missing this. She had traded a lifetime of these beautifully ordinary, sacred moments for a fantasy that had turned to dust. There was no need for revenge. Our peace, our laughter, our love that was the final, unassailable victory. We had found a new kind of quiet, not the fragile silence of absence, but the resilient, joyful silence of a family made whole, a family that had been tested by the storm and had, against all odds, learned how to build a home in its aftermath.